Okay, good evening, everyone. As I just said before, apologies for getting the source sheet out late. So I'm going to stick it as a in the chat function, and if you just click on that, you'll be able to see the sources. And we're going back to our usual format of half an hour Parsha, half an hour Halacha, after a rather extended break from that format. Many of the mitzvahs and dinim of Cohanim are discussed in this week's Sedra, and therefore I thought I would focus on looking at the psukim and trying to understand what's really going on with these. I spent a lot of time weighing up whether to give shiur on Lag BaOmer or on the Parsha, but decided in the end we'd go for the Parsha. For those who have joined late, as I just said, I've posted the sources in the chat function. Now, it's quite hard to, when we look through the vast array of dinim which are relevant to Kohanim, it's quite hard to sort of define their role, to understand what they are, what of Kohanim, what's the common denominator between them, and also what is the relationship between Kohanim and Levi'im. What's the relationship between Cohanim and Levi'im, or what are the differences between Cohanim and Levi'im? It's a very remarkable thing that in Judaism we have two priestly castes. We have Cohanim and Levi'im, and they both function as with sort of priestly roles in the Beis HaMikdash. What exactly are they? What exactly do they do? And how do they relate to Yisrael, to the rest of us who are just commoners? So what are the halachas, the main roles of Kohanim? So when we look at the psukim, including the psukim in this week's Sedra, we see many different functions. They serve in the Beis HaMikdash, or the Mishkan, with korbanos. They have the privileges of receiving what's called the matnos kahuna, the gifts, the tithes that Kohanim receive, truma and maaser from agricultural produce and various sections from animals that are eaten. They have additional responsibility with respect to truma, to not becoming tomei mace, not becoming impure to dead bodies. And for many Kohanim nowadays, this is the main halacha that remains, not to become tomei. Then they have various halachas of kovods, of honors that are given to them, which we'll hopefully have time to discuss a little bit later this evening. They're called up to the Torah first. Zimun, they, if one's benching, they are invited to lead Zimun first, and various other laws of respect and kovod with which they should be treated. And we'll deal with some of these later. There's also a series of prohibited marriages into which a Cohen can't enter, primarily a divorcee. And these are the sort of halachas of Kohanim. Interestingly, there's also halachas which apply to all Jews, but about which, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, the Torah teaches us about Kohanim in particular, and then extends the halacha to other Jews. In other words, some of these halachas we just mentioned are restricted to Kohanim. Only a Cohen serves in the Beis HaMikdash. Only a Cohen receives the matnos kahuna, the foods, the agricultural tithes that are given to Kohanim. But then the other halachas, which apply to all Jews, but are taught with respect to Kohanim, and then extended to non-Kohanim. For example, there's a halacha that one should not tear one's hair out, one shouldn't scratch oneself in mourning, and this is taught to us with respect to Kohanim and then extended even to non-Kohanim. So what are we meant to make of all these halachas? So I'm going to argue, if we look at the source sheets, I'm going to suggest that there is a theme that emerges by looking at a parallel between the role of Kohanim and the state of Adam Harishon, how humans were first created pre-sin, pre the chait of Adam Harishon, when we lived this idealized life in Gan Eden, and where our role was just to serve Hashem. And the argument that will be made is that Cohanim are effectively a group of people who are given the privilege and responsibility of living in this idealized pre-sin of Adam Harishon, Gan Eden type condition, Gan Eden type state. In other words, human beings were initially created not to live in the world as we know it, but to live in Gan Eden. It's a whole topic in its own right, what exactly this means. But however exactly we take the story of Bereshis, it's telling us something about the human condition. That humans were meant to live in one state of existence, a Gan Eden of sorts, but for some reason or other, we can't live in that idealized life and we have to live otherwise. That's what comes out of the story of Bereshis. And it's really reflecting an inner tension that many of us perhaps experience in our lives. Wouldn't life be wonderful if all the distractions and the hassles and the challenges were removed, and then we could just focus on that which we feel we really ought to be doing? Pre the sin of Adam Harishon, we didn't have the stress of earning a livelihood, of earning a parnasa. Everything we needed was easily accessible. And we didn't have the challenges of maintaining our existence. And this is telling us something about how humans want to live. And yet in practice, that's not how we can live. Were we to live like that, perhaps life wouldn't be so good after all. Post the sin of Adam Harishon, at least, post us discovering and uncovering and realizing something about human nature, we came to realize that living without responsibility isn't necessarily so good for us. It's idealized in principle. Were we up to it, that should be the way we live. We aspire to it. Once again, Emor Hashem when Moshiach comes. But in the meantime, it's not just that humanity was punished by being removed from Gan Eden. Why would Hashem punish us unless there was something therapeutic, something rehabilitative in the punishment? All punishment from HaKadosh Baruch Hu is meant to be a lesson. It's meant to be rehabilitation, restorative. It's meant to bring us back and restore us to how we're meant to be. Post the Chet Adam Harishon, human condition is such that to live a life where there's no challenge, where there's none of the stress of earning a livelihood, wouldn't be a healthy life. We need it for ambition. We need that challenge. A society or a life that's too stressful indeed achieves nothing or limited amount. But a society with no pressure, no ambition, no stress also isn't healthy, isn't the way human beings can flourish. So we need to find that sort of middle level. And this is what the withdrawal from Gan Eden meant. Similarly, let's not forget that pre the Chet Adam Harishon, humans didn't die. Again, reflecting a sort of paradox we feel at the heart of our existence. We desperately want to live if all is healthy. We desperately want to exist. We feel we ought to sort of strive towards infinity and achieve things of absolute worth. And yet we don't. We're only here for a limited time. And again, it seems it's the same idea that death was introduced because we need death to focus. We need the goals, the realization that our time is limited is necessary to paradoxically cause us to not just focus on physical life, but also on that which is beyond. And were we to have eternal physical life, then again, post-Chet Adam Harishon, this wouldn't be good for us. But Cohanim seem to be the small group who are given the privilege and responsibility of living in a pre-sin state, in a Gan Eden type state, a state that in theory would be idealized, although in practice, post the sin of Adam Harishon, this isn't a good way for us to live. So let's have a look at the handout. And again, for those who joined later, I'll just post the link. And if you just click on the link, you can see the sources that I've posted, and should be able to see the psukim, which I've tried to line up in parallel, and I've labeled it comparisons in the role of Kohanim. So at the end of Parshas Korach in source 1, for those who haven't managed to see the source sheet, don't worry too much, it's not essential. At the end of the Korach in source 1, the pasuk says that Hashem said, "Vayomer Hashem al Aaron, ba'arat som lo sinchal, v'chelek lo yiracha b'soichom." Kohanim, and if we have time in the second half of the shiur, we'll look at Levi'im, do not inherit Eretz Israel. Why? Ani chelkecha v'nachlosecha. I, God, am your portion and your inheritance, b'soch b'nei Israel. In other words, Cohanim don't have a share of the land. They don't need to engage in agriculture, in the work of physically producing food. Kait v'darda. After the sin of Adam Rishon, we can only produce food by working, by farming, by tilling, by ploughing, by pruning, and by weeding, and by grinding, and by shelling. All of this is post the sin of Adam Rishon. But pre the sin of Adam Rishon, we didn't need to engage in this. Nowadays, just to get a piece of bread, we have to work 11 malachos, from ploughing through to grinding, through to cleaning, through to baking and boiling. Adam Rishon didn't have this. What was his role? As we see at the beginning of Parshas Bereishis, Vayikach Hashem Elokim es Adam, Vayenechehu b'gan ha'idin la'avda l'shamra, to work it and to guard it in a very different way, to focus on his spiritual achievements. So this is one set of halachas. What is the Kohanim's role? Exactly that, la'avda or l'shamra, to do exactly what we've just described in the Beis HaMikdash. Have a look at the continuation of source 1, where I quote the psukim from the 18th chapter of Bamidbar. In the Hebrew it's labeled Bamidbar Yud Ches, in the English it's labeled Parshas Korach. Vayom Hashem al Aaron, Ato v'necha v'ezavicha, itcha tisu es avon HaMikdash. You carry with you the responsibility, the burden, the duty. Avon is translated in English not very well as the iniquity, the sin of the Mikdash. It means the potential for sin, the responsibility not to mess up. That's l'shomra. You have to guard it and make sure nothing goes wrong. Then pasuk 2, which we'll look at in more detail if we have time later, the gamas achicha mate Levi, your brother, the tribe of Levi, they also have a role, but what's their role? The yilva, they should accompany you. The same root as the word levaya, they should accompany you. The shalsucha, they serve you, they look after the Cohen. But you, you, the Cohen, you work in the Ol Eidos. What do? B'shomru mishmatacha, you have to guard. This is the first part of the role. And the second part of the role is avodas ha'oil in pasuk 4. You do the work that's necessary. So this is la'ovda or la'shomra, to guard and to work it. The role of the Kohanim is to do exactly what Adam Rishon's role was, to guard and to work, not in the physical sense. You don't have a portion in the lands of Israel, but in the spiritual sense. Indeed, the role of the Beis HaMikdash is to bring Hashem back into the world in the same way as he was in Gan Eden. Have a look at the source set of Psukim C, which I brought in the handout. How do Adam and Chava relate to Hashem? Vayishmus kol Hashem Elokim mishalech began. They experience Hashem as walking through the garden. Obviously, this is borrowed language, but somehow they experience the revelation of Hashem as expressing itself, as being in motion and fluid, becoming ever closer. And what's the role of the Beis HaMikdash, as described in next week's Sedra? V'nosati mishkani b'sochem, I will put my mishkan amongst you. V'salachti b'sochem, I will walk amongst you. So the role of the mishkan is to once again have Hashem walking amongst us. So the mishkan is set up as a microcosm, a miniature world, mimicking the relationship with spirituality that we had in Gan Eden. And the role of the Cohen is to be the Adam and Chava, to be the spiritual role models of what it means to be a human being who is offered the privilege and responsibility of this idealized existence. We humans can't live in that idealized existence. Post the sin of Adam, we've understood that to live in a Garden of Eden, to live in paradise, to live in a world with no pressures and no strains and none of the responsibilities, to live in a world in which we don't focus on death, this isn't the way we can live. But the Kohanim are a small select group who have the responsibility and challenge of living on that level. And finally, look at the top of the second page in the handout, which is one of the most classic halachas of Kohanim. Vayom Hashem al Moshe, our week, etc. Emor ala Cohanim and Aaron, lenefesh leitamim v'amov. A Cohen has to avoid tumah. Which tumah? The tumah of coming in contact with the dead. A regular Cohen can only come in contact with very close relatives who he has the obligation to bury and to mourn. and a Cohen Gadol shouldn't become Tomei even to those. To the best of their ability, a Cohen has to avoid any contact with death. Again, because Odom, Chava, pre their sin, lived in a world in which they didn't confront death. Was that good for them or not good for them? Well, it depends. If you're up to living in an idealized state, then to not live with the pressures of work and the stress of life and the fear of death, this is something fantastic. However, if you are not up to it, then this is the most dangerous way of living at all. To forget Yom HaMisa, not to confront our mortality, is something dangerous. But the Cohanim are the select group who shouldn't be forced to confront mortality, who shouldn't be put in that position of having to deal with mortality, because they're living in a different realm, they're living in a different level, they're living in this microcosm of an artificially recreated Gan Eden, where there are these pressures and the stresses, where once again Hashem walks in the garden, and where once again we are able to directly connect to spirituality. So this is a very important theme in understanding the common denominator between the laws of the Kohanim, the tithing, the Korbanos, have a select group of Jews who live on a heightened level, a level in which they don't have to live like Odom post the sin. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail now, but if we look in source 2, this is the very famous idea in which there's a parallel between the Ovos Malachos, the 39 Ovos Malachos, Haditnan, the Mishnah. Ovos Malachos are Boim Chasa'achas. There were 40 minus 1. In English, we would say 39 forbidden labors on Shabbos. Keneged me, where do we derive these 39 prohibited activities from? So the Gemara derives them from Omar Lehu Chanina Bar Chama, Keneged Avodas HaMishkan, paralleling the work of the Mishkan. In other words, we have a parallelism. The Mishkan, which is constructed and built, is done so through 39 malachas, paralleling the 39 creative activities that we humans have to desist from engaging in on Shabbos, which are the 39 channels or vehicles through which we master the world. So we need to bake bread. There's 11 steps before we can get bread. This is the toil of human life. We need to plow and sow and reap and grind and shell and husk and knead and eventually bake our dough into a bread, and that's when we get bread. So these are the 39 vehicles. There's food preparation, there's clothes preparation. The 39 malachas are divided into 4 groups of basic human needs. The first 11 malachas are about food production. It's the first of human needs. Then there's shelter production, boina, building, and associated malachas. We humans need shelter. Then there's clothing, the production of clothing, weaving and shearing wool and making clothing. And finally, there's the 4th category of malachas, which is about communication. It's not just now that we live in a communication age. Humans always need to communicate. This is a 4th area of the most basic of human needs: food, shelter, clothing, and the ability to store information, which is Kosev, is the set of malachas associated with writing, preparing ink, and so on. We discussed this when we spoke about the malachas in the introduction to Hilchos Shabbos. So these parallel the Mishkan, and others. The Mishkan has in its creation, the creation of a microcosm, a small world, reconstructed using these same 39 malachas. So these are the basic dinim of the Kohanim. Now there is a set of halachas that apply to Kohanim, which are really halachas on us, non-Kohanim, about how to treat Kohanim. Included in the mitzvah to Moshe to appoint Aaron, the pasuk also says v'kedashtam, you should sanctify Kohanim. There's a mitzvah to sanctify Kohanim and to give them honor as a reflection of this status that we've just spoken about, the kedusha that they possess. How do we honor them? Well, the most famous application of honor is that we call them up first to the Torah. The Cohen gets the aliyah, the Torah first. But there's other applications of this honor also. When there's other mitzvahs to do, they really should be offered first, whether it's making kiddush or berachas hamazon or the bracha on motzi. If you have a meal in which a number of shared people are eating the meal together, the Cohen should be the one who's offered to make kiddush and bench and brachas, and indeed served first. We'll see shortly these are halachas of Cohanim, not halachas of Levi'im. Now, the reason we are not perhaps as familiar with these halachas as we should be is because a Cohen is allowed to be moichel, is allowed to absolve others, forgive, release others of the responsibility of paying this respect. And therefore, there's an assumption very often that Kohanim forego the halachas of kavod. And based on the reason they can forego this is either because they're allowed to be moichel, they're allowed to absolve it, or because a deeper respect, the deepest honor to someone is Ratzono shel Adam, the honor you give a person is by acquiescing to their will, and therefore since the Kohen is happy for someone else to get the honor, then that's the way of showing honor. And therefore a Kohen is assumed to grant permission to others and not to always demand their respect. The only exception to this, by the way, is the Aliyah Torah. A Kohen is not allowed to forego their honor of being called up to the Torah, to be called up first to the Torah. And this is because of a special takana d'Rabbanan to avoid disagreement in shul. We know as it is that kibbudim, the various honors in a shul, are on occasion a source of tension, who gets what. Humans are drawn to kavod, our capacity to seek honor is significant, and therefore to resolve this problem, a rule was made that Kohanim always get called up first if they're present, and hopefully that somewhat diminishes their tension in shul. And this is a very ancient takana that dates to the time of the Mishnah. So you see, this isn't a new phenomena that people wanted to compete to get the honor first. I'll add, by the way, that besides the halacha of honoring a Kohen, there's also halachas of sort of a twin part of the halacha of not allowing the Kohen to serve one. So one shouldn't easily ask a Kohen to serve us something, particularly if it's a task which is demeaning somewhat. Now again, it's possible for Kohen to be moichel, but since this is an active diminishment of the Kohen status, mechila doesn't help to the same degree. Not giving a Kohen the right to go first if they are moichel, if they waive their honor, is one thing, but it's another thing removing the honor of a Kohen by actively belittling them and having them do something which is somewhat demeaning or degrading. There are exceptions to this. If you, for example, are the host at a meal, then since this is your home, you don't have to offer the guest, the Kohen, the honor of kiddush or benching or hamotzi. So if you are a householder, the balabais, and you have a Kohen as your guest, in that case, you don't need to say Rishus Kohen because you own the right, as it were. These halachas are when you're not the householder, when it's not your home, where it's neutral. Similarly, if the Kohen receives payment for doing the service, then again, this isn't an abuse of the Kohen, this isn't a diminishment of his kavod. So the degree to which these halachas are applicable is somewhat limited, but nonetheless, it's something we should be conscious of, and perhaps we forget these. These halachas, I think, are also forgotten. The post can discuss several reasons why these halachas have become somewhat forgotten. Perhaps since post the destruction of Beis HaMikdash, this halacha doesn't apply fully, because unfortunately we live in a world in which Kohanim don't have this role. So there's just discussion about the post about the exact extent of the service which is owed to, the honor which is owed to Kohen. But I want to just use the little bit of time available that's left to speak about the other type of priestly caste, the Levi'im. And it's a remarkable thing, a very strange thing, that there's two sorts of priests, two sorts of people that serve in the Beis HaMikdash, the Kohanim and the Levi'im. So what's the difference between the two? So on the source sheet, I printed an absolutely fundamental and fascinating Meshech Chochmah on this topic. And the Meshech Chochmah, in his normal manner, takes a remarkable leap and draws our attention to a completely different set of halachas. And this is a Gemara in Megillah that talks about the status of items of Kedusha. So we have items of Kedusha, like the Sefer Torah, the scroll, which carries a mezuzah, the tefillin, which carry within them Kedusha, they carry the words of Hashem. Now the Gemara says that Tashmishei Kedusha, that which serves the holy artifact, also has Kedusha, also has sanctity. It also has a Kedusha, it serves directly that which is Kaddish. However, Tashmish, or Tashmishin, something which serves something else, doesn't have Kedusha. It's too far removed from the source of Kedusha. So it's something which is sanctified, is holy in and of in itself. Tefillin have Kedusha. The tefillin bag, the velvety bag around the tefillin, or the box perhaps around the tefillin, is a tashmish of Kedusha, it's the direct container. But the plastic bag that's around the tefillin bag, this is a tashmish, and therefore doesn't have a direct Kedusha. Or another example, we don't often think about these things, when you have a book that contains Divrei Torah. So what about the cover, the hardback cover of the book? This has not a word of Torah on it, it's just a title page. Nonetheless, it has Kedusha because it serves the book. It's part of the Sefer, it's a tashmish of the rest of the Sefer. But the bookcase is tashmish to tashmish, it's something which holds something, and therefore it doesn't directly have the Kedusha. So there's an extensive halachic literature around this, which often comes to practical application, around which things need to be disposed of in a respectful manner. Says the Meshech Chochmah in a brilliant piece of reasoning that Kohanim have Kedusha. Why? Because they are tashmish to Kedusha. They serve that which is Kaddish. The Beis HaMikdash, the Karbonos, they serve directly the role of Kedusha, and therefore the Kohanim have a direct received Kedusha, as per the halacha of tashmish Kedusha, of that which serves Kedusha. However, the Levi'im, well, what is the role of Levi'im? The role of Levi'im is to serve the Kohanim. Let's have a look again in our source sheet at source 1, the psukim that we had in source 1. What do the psukim say? Well, let's read the psukim in the 18th chapter of Bamidbar. In the Hebrew it says Bamidbar Yud Ches. In English it says Parshas Korach. Vayom Hashem al Aaron, Atzov anecha beis avicha, you serve directly in the Beis HaMikdash. That's pasuk 1. V'gam es achecha matzei Levi, shevet avicha, your brethren, the tribe of Levi, hakrev itcha, bring them near with you. V'yilovu alecha, they will accompany you. V'yoshalsucha, they will serve you. They are your assistants. However, you alone, the Kohanim, you're directly working in the Mishkan. Meaning the role of the Levi'im is to serve and to help the Kohanim. So they are the tashmish, serving the servers, and therefore they don't have a sanctity themselves. So you have the Beis HaMikdash with the Kedusha. Those who serve the Beis HaMikdash, the Kohanim, with the Kedusha, tashmishe Kedusha, like the tefillin box of the mezuzah case. And then the Levi'im who serve those who serve, who are tashmish to tashmish and therefore don't have their own Kedusha. In fact, Pasuk Beis seems to be consciously punning the name Levi, and maybe this is the reason why Levi'im are called Levi'im, because it says, V'yilovu alecha, they shall accompany you. The Levaya, the accompaniment, is the role of the Levi'im. So the very meaning of the name is perhaps accompaniers. They are those who serve the servants of Hashem, rather than, or the servants of the Beis HaMikdash, those who serve in the Beis HaMikdash, rather than being the servers of the Beis HaMikdash themselves, rather than being the tashmish of Kedusha. And this concludes the Meshech Chochmah, the difference between Kohanim and Levi'im. The Kohanim themselves have Kedusha, sanctity, and similarly the tithes they receive are tithes of sanctity. Kohanim get truma. When we spoke about kashrus, we spoke about tithing. The portion of the Kohanim, the truma, cannot be eaten by a non-Kohen. It's Kaddish and can only be eaten by a Kaddish, by a sanctified person. However, the portion of the Levi'im also get tithes, because they need, but for the Levi'im, it's a much more utilitarian reason, much more functional reason. They need the tithe, not because they are fundamentally Kaddish, not because they are like Adam and Chava, serving in Gan Eden Hashem, but because they need to be maintained. And therefore, the Levi'im are given a tithe, the Maaseh, but the Levi'im can choose to sell or feed it to non-Kohanim, gift it to non-Kohanim to eat also, to non-Levi'im to eat also. It doesn't have an intrinsic Kedusha such that it can only be eaten by the Levi'im. It's the property of the Levi'im. It should be given to the Levi'im, but then the Levi'im can do with it what they want. It doesn't contain a Kedusha in itself, says the Meshech Chochmah, as opposed to the Truma, which contains within it the kedusha itself, the sanctity itself, because the Cohanim are Kodesh, and therefore that which is given to them is Kodesh. Finally, and I'm not going to dwell on this too much, in Pasuk 4 of the 18th chapter of Bamidbar, the source from Parsha Korach, it refers to something called the Zar. The Zar is translated in English as the common man. That's a mistranslation. It's the stranger, as in Modern Hebrew, the non-Kohen, the alien. Kohanim are contrasted to Zar, to a non-Kohen, as the Meshech Chochmah points out, because a Kohen has a unique status. He's a unique sort of Jew. He has this heightened kedusha, whereas the Levi'im don't have the concept of an alien to Levi'im, because Levi'im are the same as the rest of us, just they have a role of serving the Cohen. They have a functional role. It's a functionality about them, a job, a task, but not an intrinsic existential difference. They're not fundamentally different in their kedusha. It is for this reason that there's a direct mitzvah to honor a Cohen. A Cohen is called up first. When a Cohen is called up first, a Levi is called up second, because the Levi is Levoya, is the accompaniment, the server of this Cohen, and therefore the Levi is called up second. However, when there's no Cohen present, the Levi isn't called up second. Because if you're in a minyan where there's no Cohen, then you can call anyone up, because the Levi's role is that as the accompaniment of the Cohen. But when a Cohen is called up first, then the Levi is called up first. When no Cohen is present, the Levi isn't called up first. Finally, we mentioned that there are sets of halachas which apply to all Jews, but are taught to us about Kohanim. And this is because all of us are mamleches Kohanim. We are described as the kingdom of Kohanim. We all have some aspect of Kahuna and Nevi'ah about us, even though we're not fundamentally Kohanim. And therefore, one aspect of distancing ourselves from death, only a Kohen has to distance himself from death, can't become Tommy. Only a Kohen has to have that unique Odom, pre-sin, Gan Eden type halacha. However, a level of despair associated with death, ripping hair out, clawing oneself, is taught to us about Kohanim. And then the Pasuk extends it even to non-Kohanim, to the rest of Israel, because all of us have this Kohen-like nature to a degree. So this is a summary of the halachas of the Cohanim and Levi'im, and hopefully gives us insight into their roles with the brilliant comparison of the Meshech Chochmah, in which compares the role of Kohanim to Levi'im. Kohanim have a fundamental kedusha; they directly serve the kedusha. Levi'im serve the servants, and therefore don't have a kedusha themselves, and have a functional role to accompany and look after the Kohanim as per their name. So we'll stop there, the Parsha half of the Sedra, and we will go back to discussing the halachic part of what we're meant to be learning. And I'm conscious that there's been a long gap since we last learned these halachas. So I will remind you that we were learning the halachas of Bishul on Shabbos, and we had discussed most of the basic principles. So I'm very briefly just going to remind ourselves of the basic principles of Bishul. Bishul is a change in an object, normally a change of state in an object, through the application of heat. In the context of food, the significant change is making it edible. So with solid food, making it edible is the significant sea change that occurs that qualifies it as Bishul. In the case of liquids, where the heat is what is an important element, we discussed the measure of heat, which is Yad Soledes, when it feels significantly hot to the touch, that the hand instinctively pulls back, finds it's a little scalding, which is about 45 degrees or so. So we discussed the level of heat in liquid that counts as cooking, and the change in food, edibility, which also counts as Bishul. We also discussed the fast food scenario, the scenario of food that's made on the go, labeled in halacha ma'achal ben drosoi. Ben drosoi was the bandit who never had time to cook properly. And we said that was the threshold between raw and cooked, is when something becomes barely edible, just edible, fast food, on the go, bandit edible, which is either a third or a half cooked. So these were the basic terms. We then spoke about heat levels, about, kli rishon and kli sheni, the fascinating concept that something on the cooking with secondary heat, cooking with a kli sheni, cooking with heat that's directly on the fire is cooking. Cooking with a pot taken off the fire, but that was directly on the fire, can also cook. But once you have it poured into another pot, even though the water is very hot, it's 90 degrees, nonetheless, normally we assume it can't cook because it is too far removed from the original heat source, which was fire. We saw that cooking is only bishul when it's a fire heat source. We discussed when you use heat sources like microwaves or solar energy, this may not be bishul, and therefore through that we explained the principle of cooking directly on the fire or in a pot which was on the fire, but when you cook with secondary heat, with klisheni, it's too far removed from the fire, and therefore in general isn't considered bishul, at least as far as Torah law is concerned. And we discussed some of the cases when klisheni one can or cannot cook in a secondary utensil. So these were the ideas that we discussed in previous weeks. I want though to move on and to talk about one more fundamental halachic principle around bishul, and then hopefully still today have time to speak about some of the applications. And this is a very important halacha, which states an intuitive principle. And the intuitive principle is, ein bishul acha bishul. There's no cooking after something is cooked. Once something has been cooked, it's already cooked, and therefore ein bishul acha bishul. So if I have a potato and I boil the potato on Friday, and it's fully cooked before Shabbos, even though it has now cooled down, as far as Torah law is concerned, I could put it back in a pot and heat it up again, and it wouldn't matter because it has already been cooked. So this is the principle as far as Torah law is concerned of ein bishul acha bishul. However, there's a number of limitations and parameters to this rule that we need to understand. One big set of limitations is, and I stress again, this is as far as Torah law is concerned, not as far as rabbinic law is concerned, and we'll need to get to the Rabbanons around these halachas, hopefully later on today, and if not today, then next week. So at the moment now, we're only in the territory of provisional discussions, because we are discussing Torah law, but we're not discussing yet the associated Rabbanons. However, at least as far as Torah law is concerned, a solid food, what's called davar yovish, a dry food, in other words, not a liquid, but a solid, can be reheated on Shabbos with the same method of cooking, which heated it the first time. And since nothing further effectively is taking place, this wouldn't be a problem of bishul on Shabbos. So this is a very important halachic principle. Let me just spell out what we mean by saying through the same method of bishul, the same method of cooking. If you boil a potato and it's already been cooked fully, reboiling it doesn't add a degree of bishul. It is true that it might become a little bit more boiled or a little bit more cooked, but this isn't a significant enough change as far as Torah law is concerned. Bishul was the change of making it from raw to cooked. It's already cooked. Becoming a little further cooked isn't halachically significant enough, and therefore I can boil this potato again. However, if the potato is boiled, I can't bake it, because that's a different quality of cooking. So in brief, even though ein bishul acha bishul, once something is cooked, you can cook it again as far as Torah law is concerned. However, if it's a different form of cooking, like roasting or frying or baking, you couldn't substitute a baked good and now boil it, or a boiled good and now bake it. Let me give you an example. If you have a boiled chicken and you wish to warm it up on Shabbos again. Now, as far as Torah law is concerned, it was boiled and cooked once, so you could, in theory, cook it again. There are technical issues around how you would do this. The water would already have to be on the flame, and we'll discuss in a few moments the drabbanons associated with this. However, if you want to bake the chicken now, so you want to take the raw chicken and bake it now so it becomes crisped and baked, that's already a different eating experience, and this would be a problem to do on Shabbos, because even though ein bishul acha bishul, however, there is shehiyah after bishul. There is a different sort of cooking, roasting and frying. I don't want to go into all the halachas because these are rather technical, but in brief, halacha knows of two sorts of cooking. It knows of boiling and of roasting. Baking, which is a distinction that we draw in the English language, isn't in Halacha generally considered to be an important distinction. What's really the difference between a roast potato or a baked potato or a roast a chicken or a baked chicken? These are just different ways of dry heat cooking as opposed to wet heat cooking. So boiling would be where you boil in water. Roasting and baking would be where you do so in a dry heat, whether it's in an oven or on a pot roast or over a spit. These are all effectively the same. They are dry heat cooked and crisp and create a different sort of food experience, and therefore you couldn't switch the type of cooking. Frying is a little in between, a little more complicated to work out, because when you fry in, if you fry in a deep fry, it's effectively immersed in liquids and it's a bishul of sorts, it's a boiling of sorts. If you bake something dry and you just put some spray on a little bit of oil in order to stop it sticking, then that's effectively a dry cooking, it's a baking. So what we refer to in the English language as frying could be two very different phenomena. It could be a deep fry immersed in a liquid, which is boiling. It could be a fry which is just added for non-stick, in which case it's baking. Or it could be frying where it's more than non-stick. It's you want to fry something but not deep fry it, in which case it's a little bit difficult to determine whether it's boiling or roasting, and in halacha, this would remain a little bit of an indeterminate level. So just to summarize what we have said so far, so that this isn't confusing, as far as halacha is concerned, min ha-Torah, as far as Torah law is concerned, once something is boiled, you can boil it again. Once it's baked or roasted or fried, you can bake or roast or fry it again. However, once something is boiled, you can't roast it. Once it's roasted, you can't boil it. I should mention, by the way, and this is important when it comes to reheating things, not always if you just lightly reheat something dry is that considered roasting. It may just be an effective way of warming it up. It's only when it's under a proper intense heat, which will crisp it or roast it, that this concern applies. So this is with solid foods. With liquid foods, it's very different. Because with liquid foods, the cooking doesn't really make a significant change to the eating experience. It's the heat that we want in it. So if you take chicken soup and heat it, the pleasure of the reheating of the soup is that it's now hot. It's eaten hot. That's the significant change that matters. And if it cools down, effectively, even though it's a cooked soup, but it's a cold soup, the effect of the heating has worn off. And only when we reheat it does it have the pleasure of eating a hot soup again. And that, therefore, is the significant change that has occurred. And therefore, when it comes to a liquid, referred to in halacha as a dover lach, a liquid cannot be reheated once it has gone cold. Reheating it would or perhaps might count as a bishul, as a cooking, even though it was heated already once before. So when it comes to liquid, the pertinent information is hot or cold. Am I reheating it? When it comes to solids, I need to think, am I re-cooking it or not? That's the difference between the two. Now, I was a little vague when I spoke about liquids. I said it is or it might be bishul. And this is because there's a significant machlokus between Ashkenazim and Sephardim in this area. Machlokus between the Ramah and the Shulchan Aruch about reheating liquids and exactly how to view liquids in this discussion. The Shulchan Aruch is of the view that Torah law says that cold liquids which you reheat is a bishul min ha-Torah, is considered transgression of the Torah prohibition of cooking. This is the view of the Shulchan Aruch and the Pesach for Sephardim. Whereas the Ramah is fundamentally of the view that even liquid which is cooled down can be reheated, but nonetheless says if it's cooled down completely, one shouldn't reheat it. If it's cooled down such as it's warm, but still has some of the pleasure of heat, then you can reheat it. It's cooled down so much that it's not suitable for its function as a hot drink or a hot soup, then the Ramah says we are stringent not to reheat it, even though the Ramah himself isn't convinced that there's bishul even with liquids. So basically, this distinction between solids and liquids for Sephardim is a pure Torah distinction and a very strict one. For Ashkenazim, it's a little less black and white, though in practice we are careful not to heat down properly cooled down liquids. So solids, solid foods, dry foods, we can reheat on Shabbos as far as Torah law is concerned. Once they're already cooked, they're cooked. Liquids, Only if it's still hot, we can maintain the heat or increase the heat. If they're cooled down, we cannot do so. And this is as far pre the rabbinic level, before Drabbonans. Now, in a few moments, not this year, but actually next year, we're going to discuss the situation of putting a food back onto the flame on Shabbos. This is the most common kitchen shiur. I have food in the fridge at night. Shabbos day, I want to heat the cooker up. I want to heat the food up. What can I reheat? What can't I heat? So we will see next week when we look at these halachas, the laws of blechs and the various drabbonons of covering flames and so on and so forth that are put in place. That we will look at next week. But before we can look at that, we need to consider the deraisa, the cooking aspect that's going on. So if this is a raw food, then even if I've got my blech and it's covered and I fulfill all the other conditions, the knobs of the stove are covered and everything is in line with rabbinic ordination, nonetheless, I'm putting raw food on the flame and cooking it. That is Bishul, as far as Torah law is concerned. However, if it's already cooked solid food, then as long as I make sure that my flame is covered and everything else is in place, which we'll discuss next week, then I can heat it up on Shabbos because it's a solid. If it's a liquid, however, again, it won't help that my flame is covered. It won't help that I've got a blech. It won't help that I've covered the stoves, the dials on the stoves. Why won't it help that I've covered them? Because through reheating it, I'm doing a bishul, and therefore covering is irrelevant. I can't warm up a dover lach. I can't warm up something which is a liquid. So this is a massively important distinction. If it's a solid and fully cooked, then reheating is a theoretical possibility. In place, which we'll discuss. If, on the other hand, it's a liquid and it's cold or it's raw, then reheating isn't a theoretical possibility. Covering with a blech and an upturned pot and all the other things I do are all irrelevant because I'm cooking on Shabbos. It's not going to help me. And therefore, the question of what is considered dry and what is considered wet, how dry does a dry food need to be in order to be allowed to be reheated is an important one. And I'm going to discuss, there's many different scenarios, but I'm just going to discuss two very common applications of this halacha. One is something which is a solid when cold and liquid when heated. This is very, very common with congealed gravies and the like on food. Should this be viewed as a solid or a liquid in terms of the halachas of Bishul? So there's some discussion around this, but the halacha is in accordance with the lenient opinion that congealed gravy and the like should be viewed as a solid, and therefore I can heat my meat that's sitting in a congealed gravy. And I don't need to be concerned about Bishul as long as the other conditions are in place. And there are a variety of other halachic considerations here. So this isn't a final pasuk till we have another couple of weeks. But in principle, we wouldn't say that there's Bishul here, since when I put it on the flame, it is already solid. The other question that's often asked is how dry does the solid need to be? I mean, let's say you have a piece of chicken. So the piece of chicken is a dry food, it's a solid food, and we've said that you can cook it, you can reheat it on Shabbos as long as the other conditions are fulfilled, because this is not called bishul because it's already been cooked. But the chicken is not completely dry, it's always got a little bit of moisture around it, it's always got a little bit of gravy around it. And there's two ways of considering this matter. My personal opinion on this is that if there is a significant body of gravy or liquid, one should not reheat it. One should view this as a liquid, since there's a significant body of liquid. And I always describe it as a pool of liquid. If there's a separate body of liquid, then one shouldn't reheat it, even though overall the dish is majority solid. However, if it's just a little bit of liquid sticking to the sides of the solid, the chicken is sweating, there's sweat on the chicken, there's not a separate pool of liquid, then it can be viewed as a solid and it can be reheated. This is my personal way I paskin, and this seems to me to be the more appropriate psak. There is an alternative opinion which says that as long as this dish is majority solid, even though it is minority liquid and it's a significant pool of liquid, one can nonetheless reheat it. So you have a dish which is predominantly solid, even though it does have body of liquid, a pool of liquid, nonetheless this can be reheated on Shabbos since it is majority solid. Now this view is put forward by a very senior posek by the Prima Godim, who in Halacha is considered a most significant and important posek. Nonetheless, it's a very difficult opinion to understand, because who cares what the majority of the dish is? The fact is, I am reheating a liquid, so why should it make a difference that this is the minority of the liquid or the majority of the liquid? Nonetheless, I'm reheating it. And therefore, many of the later poskim do not understand this stance, and I personally don't paskin like this Prima Godim. I mention it simply because there are other Rabbanim who do, and therefore anyone who has received an alternative pasak shouldn't panic based on what I'm saying, and that's why I mentioned the alternative opinion. But for those who are asking me their shilas, I believe that one should not reheat a food which has a significant body of liquid, only if there's a sort of little bit of liquid sticking to the sides of the solid food. Otherwise, if it's a proper pool, it shouldn't be reheated, irrespective of whether it is the majority or the minority of the food. So this is the issue as far as Torah law is concerned of heating or reheating food, and the halacha of Bishul on Shabbos. Now I want to shift to the rabbinic world in the remaining time available to me, because as we are well aware, there are probably more drabbanons around Bishul than any other of the melachas. And the reason for this is because it's a very common occurrence. It's the most likely sort of scenario around which Shabbos shilas will come up. We want to have food on Shabbos. It's the mitzvahs of Shabbos. We want to have warm food on Shabbos. And therefore there's somewhat of a paradox here that we want to have warm food on Shabbos, and yet doing so is halachically sensitive. And for this reason, probably, Chazal built up numerous drabbanons. Whilst most of us are unlikely to edge close to writing on Shabbos or dyeing clothes on Shabbos, or some of the other melachos we've spoken about, we all have to, by definition, edge towards warming and heating and preparing food on Shabbos, and therefore there's an array of drabbanons around the halachas of cooking on Shabbos. And the first drabbanon I want to focus on is a remarkable one, because uniquely and unusually it applies to something that I do before Shabbos. Now, normally speaking, any melacha that I set into motion before Shabbos isn't a problem that it is occurring on Shabbos. This is how we set time switches which make lights go on and off. And indeed, even without time switches, just the act of lighting a candle on Erev Shabbos, which is what we're meant to do, we're meant to light Neirus Shabbos, is in effect causing a melacha to happen on Shabbos. Because the pasuk says, Savaru Eish, fire, don't light a fire on Shabbos, and I light the fire before Shabbos, and I'm not concerned, because I'm not lighting on Shabbos, I'm lighting it before Shabbos. So setting a melacha into motion normally is not a concern, unless there's maras ayin considerations that the observer might become confused and think I'm breaking Shabbos or the like. But in principle, I can do things before Shabbos, and I shouldn't need to be concerned about what's happening on Shabbos. So as far as Torah is concerned, 5 minutes before Shabbos, I can take my potato that we discussed before, that's still raw. I can put it in a pot on the flame, turn the flame on a minute before Shabbos. It will begin heating up. The water will begin boiling, and eventually, an hour later, the potato will be cooked. And this shouldn't be a problem at all. It is true the potato is cooking on Shabbos, becoming cooked on Shabbos. Nonetheless, I set everything in motion before Shabbos. Nonetheless, D'Rabbanan, there are specific halachas about not always doing this. And this set of halachas are called Shehiyah. Shehiyah means lishhot, it's the same in the modern Hebrew. It means to leave things, to leave them, to let them sit, to let them remain. And there's halachas about leaving food remaining on the flame on Erev Shabbos. And the reason for this Rabbanon is that even though I'm doing it before Shabbos, and therefore no melachas occurring on Shabbos, nonetheless, the process of cooking is one in which I'm constantly tweaking and fiddling and moving and checking on the food that is cooking. That's the nature of cooking. That is an ongoing action. It's not just put on the fire, leave it there, and come back 2 hours later to find it cooked, generally speaking. And therefore, we are concerned that if the flame is left on Shabbos, and the potato is cooking on the pot on Shabbos, that naturally the person cooking will check up on it, and in so doing, risk tweaking the flame level, and therefore transgressing either Bishul because they are speeding up the cooking process, or Mavir, burning on Shabbos. I think we discussed the halachas of Havara in a previous sub-series of Hilchot Shabbos, by turning up or down the gas, which causes, or the wood, stoking the fires, more accurately in the past, which causes Mavir to occur. And as a result, Chazal forbade leaving a raw food cooking on an open flame on Shabbos. And I say every word with care, because even though they forbade leaving a raw food cooking on an open flame on Shabbos, because they were worried about the person cooking tweaking the heating level and, as we said, transgressing Shabbos, nonetheless, in certain instances, they weren't concerned about this. For example, if the potato is fully cooked before Shabbos, they weren't concerned because it's cooked and you're just heating it up. You're just re-warming it. Similarly, if the flame is covered, such that it's not instantly accessible to change the heat level, and you have the reminder because it's covered, again, then they weren't concerned with Shehiyah, with it being left over the flame before Shabbos. So what we're going to learn next week is a slightly more in-depth analysis of understanding the conditions that are necessary to not be concerned about cooking food on Shabbos. Now, I have to tell you, when preparing this shiurim, I considered long and hard how much detail to go into this. Because the truth is, the long-standing minhag is to always cover our flames and to make sure food is fully cooked before Shabbos. And this is very sensible because this avoids all shilas. The flame is covered, the food is cooked, no issue of Shehiyah, and no issue with moving the pot around on top of the flame from a slightly hotter place to a slightly colder place because it's already cooked. And this is certainly best kitchen practice on Shabbos. Nonetheless, I think it's important to understand a little bit more in depth about covering and how that works and when you need it and when you don't. And certainly in situations where one's running late before Shabbos in the winter and one hasn't managed to cook all the food in advance, it's relevant. It's also relevant to some of the more common questions that come up in rabbinics around buying hot plates and what are the criteria of hot plates, what makes a hot plate into an halachically acceptable hot plate, what makes a Shabbos urn into a halachically acceptable Shabbos urn. So next week we'll look at in more detail some of these halachas of Shehiyah to understand the framework behind it and why it was structured in the manner it was structured. That will be next week's mission. So I'll stop here and finish the shiur. We looked at, again, we did a brief summary of the basic principles of Bishul, Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, Dov Lach, Dov Yovish. We then looked at Bishul, Acha Bishul, cooking after cooking or baking after cooking. And finally, we mentioned the halacha of Shehiyah, which we'll look at in more detail next week. So I'll stop here for now, and I'm happy to just hang around for a few moments for questions.